Hello, animations in Godot are pretty unique. Godot has one of the most flexible animation systems as you have the ability to animate any property within any node. Godot has so many different animation features, and if you're trying to understand how to use the animation system in Godot, then it could be pretty overwhelming. But I'm here to tell you that animations aren't as complex as you think, and today we're going to cover everything you need to know about Godot animations, some helpful tips to keep in mind about animations. Then at this timestamp we will cover the animated sprite 2D in a tutorial style, and at this timestamp we will cover the animation player. So we will be learning how to create different types of animations with the different Godot animation tools. Subscribe to help other aspiring game developers, and now let's begin. First, it is important to cover the different animation nodes in Godot and what each of them do. The animated sprite 2D is the simplest one. It is good for creating simple frame-based animations, and the animation sprite can only really affect the visuals of the animation sprite node. But the animation player is much more powerful because you can animate or control just about every property within any node in that scene, whether that be collision shapes or the sprite's rotation or even calling functions during the animation. Then you have the animation tree, which uses the animations created in an animation player but allows you to, in simple terms, control and blend the transitions between those animations. It helps with the creation of things like a state machine. Now, I want to mention something that is helpful to keep in mind when working with animations in Godot, and that is getting an animation to look smooth and perfect is going to take a lot of testing and tweaking. Whether that be position, rotation, or frames per second, it most likely won't look perfect the first go around. So don't get frustrated, and just remember, creating animations is a trial and error process, and with enough tweaking you will have a product that you are happy with. Okay, so let's start out with how to use the animated sprite 2D first, which is the simpler one. Then we're going to move into how to use the animation player, which is a more in-depth, complex animation creator, and it's more custom. This is more of a frame or sprite sheet based type of animation here with the animated sprite 2D. But what we have in this project is kind of what I want to go over first. I'm going to just go over what we have, and then we're going to move into creating this player with a animated sprite 2D with animations, right? So basically what we have, I think it's important to know what we have in the game so you know what we're working with, but it's not very much, right? We have a folder down here in our file system with all of the art. We are going to have a test world with a static body, a sprite 2D, a sprite 2D, a sprite 2D, and a collision shape, which just create this little world here. And then we're going to have our player. If we go to our player scene, our player is nothing really. We have a sprite 2D, a collision shape, and a camera 2D, which is just having a zoom, so that whenever we go to our test world and we click play, we can move around and we can basically do what we can do, right? So this movement script is, let me go over this one more time. This movement script is the most basic thing in our entire game. This is the default Godot movement script. So this is whenever you create a character body 2D and you say add script, this is the beginning code. This is what it starts with. So I didn't change anything here within the code. So it's the most basically starting project that we have, and then we're going to create it into something that actually looks halfway decent, right? So what we're going to do is we're going to start by creating the animated sprite and adding that to our player scene. So we can go up to the sprite 2D, we can click on the delete key, and we can delete the sprite 2D. If we go back to our 2D view, we're going to see that that is completely gone, and now we don't even have a player. So to do that, we can go to our player here, click on this plus button, and we can add in our animated sprite 2D node. This animated sprite 2D node is actually going to have a lot of stuff that I want to go over, right? So over here in the inspector, we're going to have an animation tab and an offset tab. These are the only two that are really important to the animated sprite. The rest of them are pretty much universal with every other node in Godot, right? So the transform, of course, is the position, the rotation, the scale, all that stuff. The offset, though, is also pretty much universal with all other nodes in the Godot, but with the animated sprite 2D, we have some different settings. We have a flip H and a flip V, which is flip horizontal and flip vertical, which we're going to go over, and we're going to end up using these later on in this video, right when we get into the scripting for the animated sprite 2D. And then here in our animation, this is where we're going to do our work. This is where the animations are going to be done. These are, you can kind of see what the current animation is, what frame is currently playing, and the speed at which those animations are playing. And then this is where we create our frames. So we are going to click on this empty piece. We're going to click on new sprite frames, which is going to create a brand new resource. Then we can click on this, and it's going to open up a new tab down here where we can actually start creating our basic animations. So all of these are different settings that I'm going to go over each one of them and what every single one of them do. So to get started, what are we going to want to do? Well, we're going to want to create an animation. Godot for us creates our default animation. This is a animation where there's nothing in here, there's no frames in here, but it is a animation nonetheless. So we can click on this default and we can actually rename it to our run animation. We're gonna make this default animation into a running animation. And for our run animation, what are we going to want to do? Well, we're gonna have different options. So to load in different information or different images, or if you want to load in a sprite sheet, you want to load in a image that's going to be a frame, you're going to end up using these two buttons. So if you have a sprite sheet and you want to take multiple frames from one single PNG photo, you're going to click on this one. If you want to just take for example, we wanted this icon to be a frame, then we can click on this one. If we click on it, you're going to see that we can click on this icon, open that, and it's going to add that here as a frame. Now it's going to look super big, but we can delete that, and then we can actually add in our actual art by clicking on this piece here, and you're going to see this is going to open up the file system. We're going to go into our art folder, and then you're going to see that we're going to have all of our art. We're going to click on the run because that's the sprite sheet that contains our running frames. Click on this, and then we can say, okay, well, the vertical is going to be equal to 1 because we have 1 frame vertical, and then we actually have 12 frames horizontal. You're going to see how it kind of splits all of these frames up just like that. If we were to change it, you see kind of how that changes with it. But if we click on these, we want to make sure that we click on them in order, and then we can even click and drag to click on all these in order. You're going to see this is going to be frame 0, frame 1, frame 2, and so on, right? We can click on add 12 frames. It's going to add all of these frames down here just like this, and then we're going to have our sprite right here as well. Now I want to go over all these functions real quick and what everything here does. So this right here is our play button. This is going to play our sprite forward. If you look over here in the inspector, you're going to see that it runs the frames up pretty slowly, but we can change that with this FPS button. With the FPS button, maybe we want it to go faster. Let's equal it to 12. You're going to see it starts moving faster. It moves through these frames at 12 frames a second. So really this animation here is going to take 1 second to completely finish, right? But there's more that we have to go over. This right here is a looping, so it is currently enabled, so our frame is looping. Whenever it gets to the 11th frame, it's going back to the 0, and so on, right? So if we turn the looping off, you're going to see that when it gets to the end, it ends. If we click play, it's going to play it, and it's going to end whenever it hits frame 11, every single time. So we want it to loop, so we can turn that on, and then we can click loop. But there are a couple things that I want to go over here again, what are these buttons right here? So let's go over these different play buttons. There's like a pause button and 4 different play buttons. What all do they do? Well, this one right here is actually going to play our animation, but it's going to start it at frame 0. So if we look over here at this inspector, you see this number here. If we click this button, it's going to end up going back to 0 and then playing forward every single time. So right now it's at 9, but now we go forward. If we go at a slower pace, let's set the frames per second to like 4 so that we can see. So you can kind of see that it's at like, it's around, 7, 8 right now, but now it's at 0, right? So every time it's going to get to like 8, I'm going to reset it, right? So it's going to basically start the animation at 0, at the frame 0, and then keep playing forward. This one is actually going to start the animation at frame 11 and play it backwards. If you click on that, you're going to see it's going to start at the very back animation, and it's going to play it the animation backwards. This right here is just going to play the animation backwards. So let's say we're on frame 4, or let's actually pause it. Let's go to like frame 4. This is currently frame 4, and then we click play backwards. It's going to play backwards from frame 4, just like that, right? So this is play backwards. This is play backwards from the last frame. This is play forward from the first frame, and this is play forward. This is pause. If we click this, it's going to reset it to, if we look up here in the inspector, if we click this square, it's going to reset it to the very first frame, just like that. And then that's kind of what those buttons do. These load in different sprite sheets, right? And in different frames, they load it in, just like we went over. That's how we loaded this in. We're going to end up using this when we create our idle and our jumping animation, right? And then these are copy and paste. So let's say we want to take this frame 11, we want to copy it, and then we want to paste it. Now we have that frame 11 twice down here, right? Then this is the delete key, so we can delete it. Then these buttons right here are actually going to allow you to move frames. So let's say we want to move frame 2 here, down here where frame 4 is. If we click on it twice, you're going to see it's going to move that frame ahead of these 2 frames. Let's move it back though, because that's going to make the animation look a little bit funny, and we don't want that here in our game. And then our frame duration right here is actually going to make different frames last longer. So let's say we wanted frame 2 here to last for 4 times as long as every other frame. If we click times 4 right here, you're going to see it's going to say, okay, well, 2 times 4. You're going to see it's going to actually pause on frame 2 for a little bit longer than all the other frames, because it's going to act like it's going to play this frame 4 times in a row before it moves on to this frame. Again, we don't really want that, so we can say, okay, well, let's go back to 1, and then that's going to look good. Now, we need to create 2 more animations, right? We need our idle animation, and we're going to need our jumping animation. So to create that, I want you to pause this video right now and try and create the next 2 animations on your own in the fastest way possible. The next animation, which is the idle animation, is going to be just like how we created this animation. But then the jump animation is going to be done a little bit different. So try and do it the best that you can. There's 2 ways to do the jump animation, but try and get the fastest way to do it. So let me know how you do, and pause this video and then resume whenever you have got it done. But I'm going to walk you through how to do it right now. So we're going to click on this button. We're going to create a new animation. This is going to be our idle animation. Our idle animation is a sprite sheet. So we're going to click on the grid here. We're going to go to our idle sprite sheet, and we're going to say vertical equals to 1 and horizontal is equal to 11 because it is 11 frames across. We can click and we can drag all the way across at 11 frames. We want this to be at 12 frames a second. So we can click on that. And then if we click play, you're going to see that it's going to look like a very nice idle animation. And we want it to loop, so make sure that this is blue. And then to create our jump animation, we're going to click on new animation. Call this our jump. Go over here to these 2 buttons, but instead of clicking this one, since our jump is just a single frame, right? It's this one right here. It's just a single frame. We can actually click on this folder icon, click on the jump, and it's going to load in that frame. And then it is going to be good to go, right? We want to make sure it loops, so we loop this same frame over and over, but that it looks good. Now, why do you do it that way? Well, let's see what happens if we try to do it this way. Let's click on the grid. Let's go to jump. It's going to bring up another panel, which, again, remember last time we didn't have to do. We say, okay, well, vertical 1, then we got to go to horizontal 1, and then we have to click on the frame and add it, and then that's how that's done. But it's the exact same frame, right? But instead, we can just click on the folder and just click on the frame, since it already is one frame and it's already been singled out as one frame. So we don't need to single it out as a frame again, right? So that's how that's done. We know what all these functions do. We kind of understand what's in the inspector. Up here at the node, if we look at the signals, the animated sprite 2D has basically the same signals that the AnimationPlayer has, which we're going to go over in a minute. But you can kind of see that you can send a signal to your script whenever the animation changes, finishes, loops, whenever a frame changes, anything like that, right? You can end up sending that signal to your script, and you can do some pretty handy things with that. So I recommend playing around with that a little bit whenever you get a chance to. But now that we have our animations complete, we have all our animations, we need to go into our script and figure out how we're going to call these animations. How are we actually going to make it work within our game, right? Because if we go to our test scene and we click play, we don't really have animations. Nothing is going on. We created the animations, but they don't play. So how do we make them play? Well, let's go to our player. Let's enter into our script. And then up here at the top, we're going to create a onReady variable. This onReady variable isn't going to do much. It's just going to grab our animation sprite path. So we can say AS for animation sprite. We can click on the equal sign, and we can get the path to our animated sprite 2D. And then, so whenever we say AS, it's really going to be like we're saying this in our script. Just makes everything a little bit easier. We're going to come down here below the move and slide under our physics process function. So this is our physics process function, right? We're going to come down here below the move and slide, and we're going to create a new animation. This is our new function. This is going to be our handle animation function. We're going to create this function here. So function handle animation, just like this. And then what do we want to happen in this animation? Well, we're going to end up calling the play on our animated sprite to play different animations, but how do we want to call them? What is the logic behind it? What order do we want them to come in? What's the priority, right? So let's think about this for a second. We have a run animation, a idle animation, and a jump animation. To play the run and the idle, that's going to be based off the velocity. If the velocity is equal to something, then we're going to play the run. If it's equal to 0, then we're going to play the idle, right? Because that means we're not moving. But above all that, if we are in the air, so if we're not on the ground, then we want to play the jump animation, because if we're not on the ground but we're moving, we don't want to play the walk animation because we're going to be in the air. We don't want to play the walk animation when we're in the air. So to do this, we can say, okay, well, if is on the floor, right? So if we're on the ground, then we want to decide on the run and idle animation. And if we're not on the floor, then we want to just play our jump animation because we are in the air. So we can say, okay, well, animation sprite dot play jump. right? Just like that. Now, if we are on the floor, then we want to see if velocity is equal to something. If it is, then we want our animation sprite dot play our run animation. And if velocity is not equal to something, then we can say animation sprite dot play our idle animation. And that's going to be how simple the animations are. But there is one more thing that we're going to have to go over with our animated sprite before everything looks smooth, right? So if we go to our test world, we click F6 to play, you're going to see that we have a idle animation, we have a run animation, but when we run this way, it's not going to flip our character, right? But we also do have a jump animation, and everything looks fine. But we need to be able to flip our character, and that's what we're actually going to do from this flip H function here. So now I can actually show you what it actually does. So down here in the offset, if we enable flip H, it's going to flip left. So this means flip H is equal to true. This means flip H is equal to false, right? So let's go to our script. Let's see how we want to do this. Right here, we can call a function. We can say, okay, well, let's call something. Let's call it like handle our sprite flip. And then we need to pass through our direction variable, which we have to go get from above in our physics process, right? So let's create this function real quick. Pass for now. Then we can come up here. You see that we get direction from input. So we can pass through this direction variable into our handle animation function. And then we're going to get our direction within this handle animation function down here. And then once we receive that, we're going to pass that variable through to our handle sprite flip. The reason I'm doing this is so that we can keep our physics process as clean as possible and as readable, and everything is as readable as possible. But once we get that direction variable, direction is going to be equal to either 1 or -1. 1 means we're going to be moving to the right, which means we want flip to equal false. If it's equal to -1, then we're going to want flip to equal to true, because we want to be facing towards the left, right? And if it's equal to true, it's going to flip it towards the left. So to write this out, what are we going to do? Well, we're going to say, well, if direction is equal to 1, then we want animated sprite dot flip H to equal to false, because that means we're facing towards the right. Else if direction is equal to -1, then we want animated sprite dot flip H to equal to true. And then that's going to be our flipping. And the reason that we're going 1 and -1 is because if we don't have any input, then direction is going to be equal to 0, right? And we don't want anything to be equal to 0. We just want it to face in the previous direction that it was facing. So if it was facing left last, then we want it to face that way. If it was facing towards the right last, then we want it to be facing that way, right? So now if we go to our test scene and we click play, you're going to see that we have a idle animation, walking animation, we have a jump animation, and then we can flip this way, we walk this way, idle this way, jump this way, and everything like that. The walking speed is a bit quick, so we can just go to our player real quick, and we can turn that down a notch, and we can say maybe 200, and then that's going to look a little bit different. But that is kind of the basics of the animated sprite 2D, right? And it doesn't look bad at all in the slightest. So I like that. I know it seems basic, but now we're going to move into a more complex animation player tutorial where we go over the animation player, and we're going to create our own little weapon animation that is animated with our player when we walk, and it's going to be thrown up into the air when we jump. So it's going to be a little bit more complex, a little bit more in depth, and it's going to be kind of us creating our custom animations. This is just creating animations from a sprite frame, but now we're going to go create custom animations by playing with the rotation, playing with the position, playing with everything like that. And that's when we're going to learn about the animation player. So let's move into that portion of the video and learn all about the animation player and creating custom animations in Godot. Okay, so to go about the animation player and learn about the animation player, what I'm going to do is we're going to walk through the very first animation, and then we're going to try and create the other two animations on our own, but I'm still going to help you and walk you through how we're going to do it. But there are a bunch of things with the animation player that I want to go over before we actually get into creating animations. But first, let's set up our scene so we can kind of understand what's going on. So I ended up importing this new piece of art. It's just a sword piece of art. It's made by a guy named Nightcat, and he makes very, very good art. I really like the way that this sword looks. It doesn't really match the exact style of this game, but that's all right for this tutorial, of course. But if you want to go check this art out and you want to download it for yourself, there will be a link to his itch.io page in the description. It's completely free and everything like that. But I'm just going to kind of customize this sword a bit, make it smaller, and that looks good, right? So maybe even a bit smaller than that is going to work. Something like this, right? But that's going to be just our sword. We can rename this to a lowercase s there, and that's our sword. Now, we need to go about how are we going to create animations. What do we do to create animations? Well, we're going to be using an animation player, right? So to do an animation player, we can come up here to our player. We can end up adding in an animation tree, not a tree. But if you do want to learn about the animation tree, I'll link a very, very good YouTube tutorial down to the animation tree. It's a very good tutorial. And I'll link that below if you want to go learn more about the tree. Since we're not going to really talk about it much, I'm going to talk about it a little bit at the end of this video, but not much, right? So our animation player. What is our animation player? What do we need from our animation player? Like, just what are we doing with it, right? What can we do with it? That's the real question. So over here in our inspector, we have a current animation. We have the speed, and then we're going to have to make sure it's active, and we're going to have the root node. The root node is always going to be set to the parent unless you change that. But it's going to basically allow you to choose the children of that root node and in the scene to control, basically. Those are the important things that we need to understand right now in this set of time. But we also have the blend here, which is basically going to kind of blend the animations. So we'll go over this in a little bit once we actually have some animations set up, right? So we don't really have an animation set up, so we can't really tell how this is going to affect it, but we'll play with that in a little bit. So to get started with creating our animation, you're going to see that it's automatically going to open up this animation tab down here in the bottom of our engine, right? It says animation, and it's basically completely empty. What do we do? How do we work this? Well, we can go and click on this animation button, and we can actually say new animation. If we create a new animation, I'm going to name this our sword, or we can name it our right, because we're going to have a right and a left. So right, sword, idle, right? When we're in our idle state, this is what we want to happen. So I'm going to walk you through exactly how we're going to create this animation, the thought process behind it, and everything like that. And then we're going to go over all the features that we have here, like onion skin. But of course, we don't really have any animation to work onion skin right now. So let's start creating some basic of our animation. So when our animation starts, our idle is going to be sort of like we're just tossing our sword onto the ground, right? We're just throwing it on the ground. So we can go here to the very start. Where do we want our sword to start? Well, we can use up these tools up here, which are the default Godot tools. We can maybe rotate it a bit, maybe drag it so it looks like it's in the hand of or on that hand of our player. We can go here to our sword. We can change the visibility, the ordering, and the z-index to equal to -1, right? So it shows behind the player like that. And then we can go to our sword, and we can actually keyframe the z-index. That will be the first thing we keyframe, and we just keyframe it just like that, so that whenever this animation starts, it is automatically going to play behind the player, right? What else are we going to need? Well, we're going to need a transform. We want to set this position, so we can click on this little key here to keyframe the position. We can also keyframe the rotation, and that's going to look good. So now whenever we start this animation, we're actually going to start it in this exact position. So it's going to look like it's in the hand. And then if we move 0.1 second forward, so this is by 0.1 second, the duration of it's 1 second. This is if we're looping or not. Right now we're currently not looping. Onion skin we're actually going to be able to use now. So if we click on the onion skin, this is actually really cool how this works. We can change different onion skin kind of settings here, but we'll just leave it as the past, right? So we can see what's happening after, or what was happening in this frame. But then if we go here and we make a change to this, right, we can't really see anything now, but if we make a change to this, what's going to happen, right? Let's maybe rotate it and then maybe move it a bit up like this. You're gonna kind of see this is where it was in the last frame, this is where it is now. That looks good. So let's set this rotation. Let's make this rotation just a 100 number so it's easier, but we can keyframe this rotation, keyframe this new position, and then you're gonna see what happens if we click play. That sword, it looks like it goes up, right? Then we can say, okay, well, let's have more. Well, what else do we want? Well, we can go one more forward. We can go to 0.2 now, and we can make some more adjustments to it. Maybe we want it to start to come out like this a little bit, maybe up a little bit more like this. And then maybe we even want it to rotate a bit more. And then we can keyframe, go a bit farther. Maybe we want it to rotate a bit more backwards now, like this. Maybe we want it to actually even out exactly. And then maybe we want it to fall down like that a bit. Or maybe we don't want it to be too straight yet. Maybe we want it to just still be like this. And then we can keyframe that, right? and then we drag this timeline along a bit farther to 0.4, and then we can make our final adjustments. Maybe we want it to end here at 0.4, maybe we want it to be a straight 90 so that it looks like this whenever it's laying on the ground, and then we can move it kind of towards the ground a bit more like that, and then we can keyframe this. Of course, our animation is 0.4 length, so we can come over here, change our duration to 0.4. We want to make sure we're not looping. We can turn the onion skin off, and then we can go over to our play button here and click on play. That doesn't really look too good, so we can make some adjustments, right? We can go over here maybe to this keyframe, right? Maybe we don't want it to go so far out. Maybe up is fine, but then here maybe we want it to start falling down. So we can go here to our sword. We can make sure we keyframe this into place there so that we start to do that. And then here we can just move this over, and we can actually take away this position. So if we click on this key here and then we delete it, maybe we want this to be the exact same position as this, right? We don't want it to move position, right? Exactly. Or we want it to make sure we're in the same X. So we can do this, and then we can make adjustments to the position. If we right click on it and then we click duplicate key, we can actually duplicate that same key. So now it's actually going to boom, boom, stay in that exact position, right? But we don't want it in that exact position. We just want it to be aligned with it perfect. And then we can kind of move this down to where we want it to be, like that. And then keyframe that position where we are, which is going to be 10Y. I don't think it's going to end up keyframing, but it's not. So we can actually click on this keyframe. We can change it manually to 10Y, right? And then if we click play, what happens? Well, it looks a bit better. Of course, it's not going to look perfect because we're not really spending too much time on it, but that looks decent for what we just created, right? You can kind of see our player throws this sword and it falls to the ground. What parts are kind of quick? Maybe this part here is a bit quick, so maybe, let's see. So this is the start. This is where we go. Then we go here, and then we go here, and then we go there. It really doesn't look too bad. Maybe let's see what happens if we make everything double. So let's double the time. Let's go to 0.8. Let's drag the ending all the way to 0.8. So this is kind of just like how we go about it. This is kind of the process of how you create animations with the animation player. We can go to 0.2. Let's see what happens now. What does it look like now? It looks pretty slow. So maybe we can have this quicker. And then let's see what happens there. So it goes up pretty quick, then it's super slow down. Maybe we want this to have a bigger gap there. Let's see. Okay, so it's looking better, to be honest. It's looking a tiny bit better. Let's see what this looks like. Let's move everything forward except this gap, right? Maybe we want the falling down here to be a little bit quicker. That looks better. So we're just going to stick with that. So we'll go to 0.6. We'll go back to the beginning. Remember what we went over with the animated sprite, where what all these buttons do? They do the exact same thing. We can play it backwards. We can play it backwards from the start. We can play it forward from the start, and then we can play it forward, right? So we can restart with that button, and then we can play. That looks better. We're just going to keep it like that. That's simple, basic. It looks good, right? So that is going to be our animation. Let's say, okay, we're happy with our animation. We like how it looks. Now what do we want to do? Well, we need to implement this into our game. And I actually kind of went into our script and kind of made a little script for us. As you can see, if we go into this script here and we kind of go over what we have, I have a animation player, right? So I made an animation player variable. We had this variable already. I made a current state variable, which is a string. And then we come down here, we end up calling a handle animation sprite passed through direction. What we're going to do is going to handle our flip the same way we did in the previous example. And then here we're going to say, okay, if current state is not equal to the choose state. Choosing state is basically when we call this, it's going to check the velocity, check everything to see what state we should be in, right? So if the current state does not equal the state that we should be in, then we're going to say, okay, current state equals the choose state. And then we're going to play the animation that matches our current state, which is based on these, right? And then we can update animation player, which is where we kind of call our animation from our animation player that we're working on right now. And I kind of created all the animation names and everything like that, so you can kind of see what we're going to be creating. But we have a right sword idle, which is the one that we just created, and then we're going to have a left sword idle, which we're about to create, and it's going to be so much quicker than the right sword idle because all we have to do is switch up a few variables. But It's basically checking if what direction our player is facing based on the animated sprite flip horizontal, and if we're in that state, right? And that's kind of how that works. And the reason I did it this way instead is because in the previous example where we were working with the animated sprite, we were calling our play animation every single frame. We don't want that. That's going to cause a lot of bugs. It's not going to be right. But now what we're doing is we're actually calling the animation one time. We're calling the animation, or we're saying play this animation one time, and we're not calling that again until we're changing the animation, if that makes sense. So this looks good. This is how the code is working. So basically, if we go to our test world right now and we were to click play, that new animation that we created, whenever we move into the idle state, is going to play. So you see that that's kind of what it looks like. Whenever we're walking, usually when we're walking, we're going to have it in our hand, and then it's going to fall out of our hand whenever we stop, kind of like that, and it's going to do it the same this way, but we haven't created that way yet. So to go about this, we can go to our player, and I kind of saw a little tweak. I want it to kind of end a little bit lower, so maybe we can do, okay, let's have it end at 12 then, and that should be a little bit better, right? So it ends more towards the foot of the player. But to create another animation, we're going to go over a little new function here, and then I want to go over some other functions like the stuff that we have down here, right? But what we have right now is a one animation. If we click on this right now, we can say new animation, or we can duplicate animations. If we click duplicate, it's going to take the exact same animation. It's going to let us rename it. We'll rename it to our left sword idle. So I'm going to kind of show you how easy it is to duplicate things right here. And we're going to say, okay, well, let's take our position. Let's change the X to -14 instead of +14. Let's change the position to -18. The Y's are going to be the same because that's up and down, but the X's are going to kind of just mirror it onto the other side. So we can say, okay, -26, just like that. And then right here, we can say, okay, -26 again, just like that. The rotation, of course, is going to exactly be negative again. It's going to just kind of mimic it the opposite way of what we are right now. Right now, we're rotating towards the right. We need to rotate backwards, right? So we can just make all these a negative version of themselves. And that should be good. If we click play, you're going to see it's going to fall, but the shadow of our sprite is actually backwards. So to do that, we can actually flip our sprite horizontally by clicking add track, add property track, add a sword track, and then flip H. And we can just add a keyframe here and say, okay, well, if we're in our sword idle, we do want our animation to be flipped. Now you can kind of see how that looks. But then that means we need to go to our right sword. We need to add the exact same thing. Sword, flip H, so that whenever we end up moving back to our right sword animation, we're not still on the flipped, right? We don't want it to be flipped. So now that we have our two animations, we can go to our test world. We can click play. You see that when we enter idle facing this way, it does that. When we enter idle facing this way, it goes like that. So that looks good, and that is basically that's a walkthrough of how to create a simple animation. Now there are some more things that we need to go over, so let's go over those now. Okay, so these functions down here are actually really helpful, and we're gonna kind of go over those now. So what this does here is if we click it, it's going to take away our tracks. Why is that? Because it's only going to show the tracks that affect the node that we have selected. So if we select sword, you're going to see it's going to show that. If we select camera, we don't really have anything going for camera, so that's not going to work. But if we go back to sword and then we turn this off, if we click this one here, what this is going to do is it's going to kind of display them. Instead of having them grouped like sword and then all the things within sword, it's just going to basically have them straight up. So let's say you can't really see anything because we don't have anything, but if we say camera and then we just change the offset, for example, and then we click this, you're going to see that it's just all going to be lined up like that. And then if we click on this button again, you're going to see it's only going to show the sword. Then we go to the camera, it's going to show the camera stuff, right? But that's how that works. And then if you want to delete a entire setting here, you can click on this trash can button. Okay. And now what we have here is we have the time here. So this is basically the intervals of when we have a keyframe. So let's say we have it at 0.05, right? 0.5 is a lot. But 0.05, then we'll be able to move keyframe to the 0.5 mark and not just the 0.1 mark. If we have this set at 0.1, then we can't really move it there, right? Because that's kind of the snap. If we don't have snap on, then we can move it exactly where we're going to want on our path, right? But if you want it to snap, then we can just say snap and then move it right there, right? So if you want to make it look a little bit more custom, that's how you would go about that. It's all down here. And then if you are trying to match, like let's say a animated sprite 2D, and you want to change it to frames per second, you can go by frames per second. So let's say your animated sprite 2D is 12 frames a second, right? Go to 12 frames a second, and then you're going to see that each of these are going to be kind of the equivalent of each frame. And the cool thing is that we're actually about to go over that right now, because we are going to have to match our run animation here, right? So our run and our idle animation, but our idle animation we're not really going to have to match because we just kind of throw it. But the run animation we're going to have to match frame by frame. So I'm going to go over the first couple frames with you, kind of explain how we're going to go about the first couple frames, and I'm going to move into a time lapse just to kind of go quicker because it is just a lot of tweaking and messing around. So to go to our animated sprite, what do we need to do to create our new animation? Well, let's click on animation, let's click on new, and then let's click on right sword run, right? This is going to create a brand new animation. We want to go by frames a second this time. So we can come down here to the bottom, frames per second. How many frames per second are in our running animation? Well, we have 10 frames per second, right? So we can go over here and we can say, okay, well, the animation is 10 frames a second. We need to go basically for 10 different frames. How many frames are going to be in the game? Well, that's just going to depend on everything else, right? But right now we have 10 frames a second. We need to animate this for 10 different frames, right? And you're going to end up seeing that, well, it's not going to be the exact length we need because we have 11 frames, not 10. So how are we going to go about that? Well, I'm going to kind of explain that here in just a minute, how we're going to end up going about that. But what we can do is we can go and say, okay, well, let's go here. Let's end up adding some tracks. Let's go to our sword. Let's start at this exact position, right? So we can say, okay, let's mark this position. Let's mark this rotation. Perfect. And then let's go down here and let's end up marking our Z index. And then let's also mark our offset flip H because we're going to end up changing that whenever we create our left sword run, right? So we can see, okay, well, what do we want to do? Well, let's go to our animated sprite. Let's move up one frame. You're going to see that this is the next frame. So maybe we want our sword to move just a tad bit up, right? When we get to that frame, maybe we want our sword to move like maybe just a tiny bit up. Rotation, we can insert this key. We can kind of duplicate it just to keep it the exact same. Then let's go to our next frame. Let's go to our animated sprite. Increase the frame by 1. It's going to be the exact same, right? So since it's going to be the exact same frame, we can say, okay, well, let's move our rotation one more. Let's take this. Let's duplicate it. Let's keep it the exact same because there's no change needed because it's the exact same frame. Let's go to our animated sprite. Increase it by 1 frame. We're going to end up moving down. So we can go, okay, well, let's move forward. And then let's move our sword down a bit to kind of match our section, right? We can click this on the position. Let's keep the rotation maybe the exact same, right? We can keep the rotation the same. Then we can go to the next frame, go to animated sprite, go up a frame. Okay, so that's a big difference. What do we want to happen? Well, let's move our sword where we want it to be, right? Let's mark the position of our sword. Let's mark the rotation of our sword. But let's actually change the Z index. Let's go down here and go and change the Z index to a +1 so that it shows in front of our player now, right? So it shows in front of our player because it's kind of like we're moving. Let's go to the next frame. Animated sprite. Increase the frame. It's going to be the exact same. So since it's going to be the exact same, we can go here and just duplicate, and duplicate the rotation. We can actually just remove these, to be honest, so it's just a straight line. Duplicate the Z index here because we can just keep that. Well, actually we don't really need that because it's going to stay here. It's not going to try and go back, like fade through it or anything. Okay, but this is the next frame. Next frame, let's move our sword up. That looks good. Let's just mark the position just like that. Let's move our rotation a bit more. Let's go to our next frame, animated sprite. Next frame, you're going to see that it's going to move a bit up. So I'm going to go and I'm going to finish this animation real fast, and I'll be right back when we get to the end and how we're going to go about doing the ending. So because this is 10 frames a second, we have finished the animation, but we need to go over that. Okay, so this is future DevWorm here. I'm actually recording this in the future because the explanation I gave on this was actually terrible. It was the worst explanation I think I've ever given on anything ever. But I'm going to kind of re-explain it right here at this exact point with this frames per second thing. If we have it on frames per second, we say, okay, the animation is going to be 10 frames a second. Up here, this is the length of the animation. So let's say, since our animation over here is actually, it says 11, but it's actually 12 if we count the 0, right? So it's actually 12 different pictures. If we go to our animation player, we can come down here and we can click on 12. And then what that's going to do is, if we zoom in, you're going to see that we're going to have 12 different frames that we're going to be able to change based on that. That makes sense. This shows you the time. So for example, this at 8 frames a second for 10 frames would be 1.25 seconds, if that makes sense. Over here, if we have, for example, our animation on our animation sprite is 10 frames a second, right? So we're going to have 11 frames. We actually have 12 frames in our animation. So how long is that going to be? Well, it's going to end up being 1.2 seconds, right? So this is where the seconds are. This is where the frames are in the animation, and this is the speed at which your animation is playing. So hopefully that gives you a little bit better of an understanding. Cool, right? But then it's going to restart back to the beginning, and then what is that going to do? Well, let's check it out. So since we changed our z-index here, it's going to end up changing back to this whenever we restart the function. So we want to make sure we go over here and we want to make sure we turn the looping on. We can turn on our animated sprite, or I mean our onion, right? And we can kind of see the movement that's going to occur with it, which looks pretty good. And then we can go up here to the test world. We click play. And then whenever we run right, we should run with a sword, right? It looks very, very cheesy, but that's because it's just a very simple animation, right? So if we go to our player, we go to our animated sprite, 10 frames a second for, I guess, is this 12 frames? Okay, so we actually have 12 frames here. Okay, so that's going to be messed up just a bit, isn't it now? Let's see. Okay, so this is the 10th frame. Let's go to the 10th frame. Let's go to the animation player. The 10th frame, that looks good, right? That should be the 10th frame. This should be the 11th frame. And then we actually have 12 frames. So we need to kind of reset that. So then we'll give it this piece right here to reset back to the default amount so it doesn't just glitch back, if that makes sense, right? So it'll kind of fade back there. Okay, let's see how that looks. Because we do have 12 frames a second, so that's why the animation was kind of getting wonky. But you can kind of see now it looks like it follows the hand whenever we run a bit more. Right? Boom, 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 boom. Now, of course, it looks funny because we spent about 5 seconds creating a, very important animation to the game. So, of course, you're going to want to spend more time. You're going to want to try and make everything look as perfect as it possibly can. But you can kind of see how the timeline works and how the keyframes work. And that's kind of what we're going over, right? So you can kind of understand how everything is coming together, how everything is working with the animation player. Hopefully you kind of understand what's happening in the inspector. You understand what's going on down here. If you have any questions at all, please let me know in the comments, and I'll be sure to get back to you just so I can help you out and get you understanding what is going on here within the animation player. So I'm going to create all of our final animations. I'm going to put it in time lapse so you can watch me completely create them all step by step, and then we'll go from there, right? Okay, so that is all of our animations created. This is our left sword jump. This is going to be our right sword jump. They look pretty nice in my opinion. I really like the look of them. The left sword run, and then again the right sword run, right? And then we have our idols as well. But if we look at how we play it, you're gonna see that when we play it, you're gonna see we're gonna throw it on the ground, we're gonna run with it, and then we're gonna throw it on the ground. If we jump, we're gonna toss it. Of course, it doesn't look very smooth, but we just threw it together here in like under 30 minutes. So they look decent, right? And it's kind of just giving you the example and trying to show you how to make use of the animation player and how you're going to actually keyframe and how you're going to work with things of that matter, you know? So basically, that is kind of how you create animations, and I hope that you were able to learn something from this video. I'd really hope that in this entire walkthrough process and watching me do it and me trying to explain what every button on this Godot engine does for the animations kind of helped you get the basics, get the basic understanding of animations. And remember, whenever you work with animations, you're going to just learn as you go. Just like anything in Godot, as you work with that feature, as you work within the engine, you're going to learn more and more about it, and you're going to become more advanced at it and start doing more advanced things, right? So this is the very basic beginner level tutorial here, trying to just, if you're new to the engine, this should be a huge help. And even if you're not new to the engine, maybe you learned something that you didn't know before, maybe you learned a different work method that you didn't know before, but hopefully you were able to learn something. I want to thank you so much for watching. Remember, if you want to check out that animation tree tutorial, I'm going to leave a link to it below. You can go check that out. It's not by me, it's by another YouTuber, but it does a very good job at it, and I really do like that for animation trees. I'm not a big animation tree guy. I don't really know the big benefit. I don't really think there is a huge benefit for using an animation tree other than just doing it in the script, but you can go check that out, and it goes over it very well. So I want to thank you so much for watching. Remember, if you have any questions, let me know. I will be sure to get back to you. I really want everyone to be helped by this video. I want this video to provide a lot of value, and that's kind of what matters to me. So it means the world to me if you ask a question, and I'll be sure to get back to you. Please subscribe to help other aspiring game developers, and until next time, stay safe and have a wonderful rest of your day. Bye-bye.